It's not many young boys who can lay claim to their very own castle. But when I was growing up in the Scottish borders, this place was my playground. Abbotsford House was built by Sir Walter Scott, mythmaker, inventor of history, and the 19th century's best-selling author, Scott's own writing desk. It's just a small mahogany piece of furniture, rather unprepossessing actually. But it witnessed the birth of quite an extraordinary output. This desk saw the creation of 12 volumes of poetry, 32 volumes of non-fiction, literally tens of thousands of letters, and 48 volumes of novels, including Waverley, Ivanhoe, Rob Roy, and my personal favourite, Red Gauntlet. Scott was the best-selling author of his day, the 19th century equivalent, if you like, of J.K. Rowling. He was published everywhere from Edinburgh to London, India to America, and translated into French, Swedish, Italian, and even Mohawk. Born in Edinburgh in 1771, Walter Scott was a man divided between two worlds. At the end of the 18th century, the Scottish capital was fizzing with new ideas, new philosophies, and a new sense of reason. A trained lawyer, Scott was very much a man of the Enlightenment. But he was also a romantic, drawn to the old Gothic ballads and ancient supernatural stories of the countryside around the River Tweed, where he spent much of his childhood, and where he eventually built Abbotsford. In his novels, Scott didn't just describe historical events, he inhabited history as much as he did this house. His characters are all formed by history. History is the hidden character in all his books. It was this that inspired everyone from Dickens to Tolstoy, and which decisively shaped how his own home country imagined itself. Scott invented Scotland, from the ballads he collected that would otherwise have been lost, through to the narrative poems where he described the Trossachs, the Borders and the Isles, to the novels where he showed how the Act of Union, the Jacobite Rebellion, even the rise of spa towns changed what it meant to be Scottish. O Caledonia, stern and wild, meet nurse for a poetic child, land of brown heath and shaggy wood, land of the mountain and the flood. Land of my sires, what mortal hand can e'er untie the filial band that knits me to thy rugged strand? But it wasn't just Scotland. It's sometimes forgotten that Scott wrote many novels set in England as well, and it's in those books we get such famous stories as Walter Raleigh putting down his cloak for Elizabeth to cross a puddle, or Robin Hood splitting the Sheriff of Nottingham's arrow in the centre of the bullseye. Scott created a version of history where Jacobites and Hanoverians, or Cavaliers and Roundheads, or Saxons and Normans could clash, and out of that clash, create something better. Scott's most audacious piece of national myth-making came in 1822, when he stage-managed the visit of George IV to Edinburgh. Scott even persuaded the king to wear a kilt for the occasion. Quite an irony, given that within living memory, rebellious Highlanders had tried to overthrow the royal family. Satirists might have poked fun at the fat king, but Scott's coup de théâtre sparked a rage for all things Highland. Scott created many of our national myths, and he did so with a theatrical panache that proved wildly popular not just in Britain, but abroad. This is rare footage of the early silent film Ivanhoe, one of two cinematic versions of the novel made in 1913, and one of the first American movies to film on location in Britain. Scott's action-packed historical extravaganzas were perfect fodder for dramatic adaptation. His work spawned over 4,000 movies, TV series, stage plays and operas. Wander around Abbotsford and you discover a similarly theatrical quality. He seemed to thrive on contradiction. He was an international celebrity who saw through the fame game, a man of the city and a country squire, a legal brain and a romantic poet. Nothing illustrates Scott's omnivorous interests as much as his library. Over the past 10 years, work has gone on to catalogue the huge collection, revealing just how amazingly diverse it is.
I think the library is the unwritten autobiography of Scott. I mean, we can see his huge range of interests in the contents, ranging from, popular culture to very high, serious tomes.
And it's not just sort of Shakespeare and the classics, is it?
Not at all, no. It's very hard to find a subject that he doesn't have a book on, in fact.
And you've actually got some of the library here, which I feel in awe that we're actually getting to touch his own books. I've seen them so often behind the cages.
This is the first book of fairy stories published by the Grimm brothers that Scott wrote and asked them to send to him. Mm-hmm. Scott then sent them books in return, and this is a letter from Jacob Grimm to Scott. He wrote in German and Scott wrote in English.
That's astonishing. Why was Scott obsessed with fairy stories?
Well, it obviously came from, I would think, from his childhood when he was ill and he went to the borders and was brought up by his grandparents who told him all the border stories, which, may be the very beginning of his life as a writer.
Although we think of him as a sort of 18th century man of reason, he's really fascinated by things like witchcraft.
That's right. Yes, he had a huge collection of witchcraft, and they were the few books that in his time he kept behind locked doors, actually. This is a manuscript, a Rosicrucian manuscript. It was probably made so it could be circulated clandestinely because they were considered politically a bit dangerous. And it has all kinds of illustrations of esoteric things. There's the Ark of the Covenant with the two cherubs, astrology and Kabbalah and alchemy.
He was almost a kind of precursor to Dan Brown in this way.
Yes, Dan Brown would be at home here.
What's this final book?
No, this is really interesting because this is the first book that was published in Tasmania. It's about Michael Howe, who's a bushranger and outlaw.
I just love these kinds of things. Narrative of the chief atrocities committed by this great murderer and his associates during a period of 6 years in Van Diemen's Land.
That's it.
It's almost like The Sun, isn't it? This kind of book.
He has a lot of books that are like The Sun, actually. Scott has a huge collection of what he calls eccentric biographies. So he's very, very interested in highway women, in pirates, in people that lived on the edge of life.
Scott married French-born Charlotte Charpentier in 1797, after courtship that lasted only 3 weeks. She was the love of his life. Unlike Byron or Burns, Scott wasn't a ladies' man. In fact, he was delightfully faithful. After Charlotte's death, Scott said that he had been heartbroken for 2 years. My heart handsomely pieced together again, but the crack will remain to my dying day. But not even a man of Scott's colossal energies and vivid imagination could outrun his troubles. In the early 1830s, he suffered a series of strokes and was sent by his doctor to the Mediterranean in the hope that the warmer climate would help him. It didn't. His final wish was to die at home. Scott became more and more ill. He was trepanned, a hole drilled into his skull. A friend said he appeared like a man mortally drunk. At times, Scott hallucinated he was King Lear. Scott's bed was brought down here to the dining room so that in his dying moments he could gaze out over his beloved River Tweed. Almost immediately after Scott's death in 1832, Abbotsford became a literary shrine, a place of pilgrimage. Scott's castle attracted huge numbers of visitors, including some of the greatest names of the day.
In here we've got Charles Dickens and his wife at the bottom here.
Here he is, Charles Dickens. That's Charles Dickens, and just Mrs. Dickens.
And Mrs. Dickens, yes.
Wonderful.
And then in this other one, we have Oscar Wilde's signature. He came to visit the house here.
There it is. Oscar Wilde, London, between somebody from Copenhagen and somebody from Galashiels.
Yes.
It's a pity we don't get a comments section down the side as well
Indeed,
to see what
yes.
they thought about it. So, Jeanette, your family has a very long-standing connection with Abbotsford.
Yes, my family have been working here since 1900, actually. My great-grandfather came here to work as a forester in 1900, and there's been family work here ever since, including myself, for quite a considerable time.
So when you first started working here, what kind of people were coming to Abbotsford then?
People from all over the world, America, Canada, Australia, but the surprise visitors that we had were actually Russian trawlermen. They had sailed into Ullapool and then on their days off they made their way down here to Abbotsford.
So from Ullapool, that must be a 500-mile round trip.
It is indeed.
It really shows you how highly he was regarded outside of the British Isles.
Definitely, yes.
In some ways, the Wizard of the North became a victim of his own success. The spell he cast over Scottish history was so powerful that it almost became a parody. Just as Abbotsford started a craze for crow-stepped gables and thistle-topped turrets, so, it's argued, Scott's novels and poems plundered the past to build a vision of Scotland unblemished by modernity. But for me, the real question is whether, without Scott, we would have any national identity at all. I think in some ways we're in danger of losing Scott's most important message. His books and this building show us how you can own the past without being imprisoned by it. After all, this was the man who transformed the mucky farmyard of Clarty Hole into the playful fantasy of Abbotsford. As he himself said, there's nothing so easy to invent as a tradition. I think we should be rather grateful to have had an inventor of such imagination and such generosity.